General Vladimir Padrino Lopez has separated the armed forces from their fundamental commitments to respect the Constitution, the laws, and the institution itself. What we can do? We need to speak at the highest level, at the level of presidents, to make joint declarations at the highest level. Member states and leaders of the world must speak up all together and explore what tools they have at their disposal to act. I'm often asked about sanctions. And let me be clear, the sanctions won't do any worse to the suffering of the Venezuelan people. A clear message must be sent to Maduro and his colleagues that the criminals whose corruption, whose strategy, and whose orders have created this crisis and killed countless of their citizens should be targeted and held account. We support sanctions to individuals that have committed crimes and are accused of corruptions. And we need more economic pressure on a government that is investing the money that it earns through the natural resources that belong to the people to fight and kill that very same people. Torture is a crime against humanity. We intend to support investigation, and we ask everybody to do so that may help to identify the practices of torture in Venezuela and those responsible for them, especially in front of the International Criminal Court. All our actions should be oriented to resolve this agenda. The agenda is free, transparent, just general elections, free the political prisoners, restore the power to the National Assembly, and an emergency plan to resolve the crisis, the humanitarian crisis of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I'll be brief in my questions. They're rather to the point. From your understanding on the issue of revenue, to the extent that Venezuela continues to derive revenues from its oil industry, is it your understanding that money is being used simply to try to finance its debt at a discount, or in essence, they're selling that oil now at a steep discount? Is it not correct that the majority of the revenues they continue to generate are largely being used for corruption and or to finance the debt, and that very little of it is being used, and it is the reason why, for example, there's a humanitarian crisis in food, medicine, and other matters?
If we see all figures about health and nutrition in Venezuela, we see that practically the government is not investing at all in its people. All figures are awful and demonstrate a clear crisis in the humanitarian crisis in the country. The rates of child mortality, the rates of maternal mortality, the rates of bad nutrition of children, diseases that were extinguished in Venezuela for decades, like malaria or diphtheria, have reappeared in the country. So we have definitely a government that is not investing at all in its people, but just to try to buy some wills, the will of through the club bags given in order to achieve some political support, and of course to keep working in their political agenda in the continent and abroad. Nothing is improving. The government of Venezuela is practically the antithesis of any government. Any government will try to bring the crisis down to problems back down to difficulties, and to make the difficulties disappear. What we see in Venezuela is the contrary. From nothing they create problems. From the problems they create crisis, and further they escalate this crisis. The situation of the people shows that the money of the national resources that belong to that people is used to kill these people. The only action of government that we see is repression these days.
The question of humanitarian aid and assistance, which the Maduro regime continues to block because they continue to refuse to acknowledge they have a humanitarian crisis. There was, however, a negotiation sponsored by the Vatican, mediated talks in November of 2016, And there was discussion about establishing a channel for allowing humanitarian aid to reach Venezuela, possibly through Caritas Venezuela, which is an organization affiliated with the Catholic Church. To date, that has not happened. For those who were not involved or did not see that process of negotiation when it comes to humanitarian aid, to this day, are they allowing humanitarian aid into the country?
They are not allowing humanitarian aid into the country. And the only measure that somehow released some pressure, some social pressure, was when they opened the border with Colombia in order to allow the people that live in border states to be able to buy their basic needs on the other side. But no international help is able to get into the country. There is definitely a need for action about that. And when you do that, these political measures, the expense of the suffering of people, is the most awful way of doing politics, and is the most coward way of doing politics.
As you're aware, the Treasury Department of the United States has imposed financial sanctions on at least 17 Venezuelans for narcotics trafficking, including 9 current or former Venezuelan officials. For example, in February, the Treasury Department imposed drug trafficking sanctions against the vice president of the country. There are also very strong allegations made by defectors and others about the involvement of an individual by the name of Diosdado Cabello, who in my personal view, based on everything I have seen, he's not simply a political leader. He is, in my view, the Pablo Escobar of Venezuela today. He is a narco-trafficker. How complicated in this political dynamic is the existence of this narco-trafficking presence in Venezuela to the political overall crisis?
When you see the structure of government and you see the closest relatives of the presidential family are in jail in New York and are judged in New York for narco-traffic, then you see that the vice president is the second in charge, has its resources for about $2 billion in the United States that have been sanctioned. When you see that number 3 is that Minister of Interior Reverol is also accused by the DEA by narco-traffic, then you have really a serious problem. Because it looks like the whole structure is taken by this by narco-traffic. So it's not how you move out of, how you push a dictatorship out of and bring back democracy. It's also now how you dismantle narco-traffic from the state, and that is a completely new challenge for our organization and for our community. That is a very serious problem, like corruption is a very serious problem. Venezuela is the most corrupt country in the continent. That in itself shows that nobody is judged by corruption in the country. The only way to judge them it is international, like the cases that involved corruption of PDVSA in Houston. So to attack these issues definitely is an imperative in all our country. To apply sanctions that can help solutions in this field are extremely necessary.
And my final question, at least for this round, because Senator Kane has joined us as well, and I want to make sure multiple members have a chance to speak to you about this topic, is the following. It is our natural inclination as a nation and as a people and in the region, as is your job working in a multinational forum, to seek for there to be a negotiated process forward. In this perfect world, the Maduro regime would realize that this is unsustainable, and there would be some sort of conversation, a serious one, about holding elections for governor, holding elections for president, freeing political prisoners, and creating that space. However, while I am not against that happening, I don't believe it is going to happen, and there's no indications that it's going to happen. And I would ask you to give us some insight into your views on negotiations, not in general, but as it pertains to Venezuela, and in particular, how the Maduro regime has used the ruse of dialogue and negotiation to buy time and divide the opposition and extend itself and perpetuate itself in power.
Yes, we have seen that, and we have denounced that. The way that the government uses dialogue is just to achieve two things mainly: to release internal pressure and to release international pressure. That happened in the first week of November last year. There were not a single commitment to deal with the agenda that is necessary to resolve in Venezuela. In fact, if in Venezuela we don't call for free and general elections, if we don't free the political prisoners, if we don't establish the constitutional powers to the different branches of government, then no solution is possible. We can go around that agenda as much as we can, but there will not be a solution. The government so far has not been able to push for a solution like that. And it is very clear that the main task, and we saw it last year during the procedure of the recall referendum, we see it this year again, is how they remain in power, no matter what. Imagine that in any country in the continent could be demonstrations and 100 demonstrators were killed. Anywhere. That government wouldn't be standing anymore. It's against the basic rules of democracy and human rights. The government, when they cannot use this tool of dialogue, they just go to repression. And then they try to move back to create some conditions of a dialogue without facing the real agenda of the country. I think these days when a real negotiation to put down a dictatorship happens, it is because the dictators come and say, look, how is the best way we get out? And that is how it starts. It doesn't start by bringing down the National Constituent Assembly. It doesn't start by trying to create side effects with the negotiations. You have to address the real agenda. So you put a date for elections. Okay, then we can have a dialogue. You free the political prisoners. Okay, we can have a dialogue. You reestablish the power of the National Assembly. Okay, we can have a dialogue. If nothing like that happens, then the conditions definitely are not there. It is awful that the people of Venezuela have been condemned to be killed in the streets or to be submitted to the peace that the dictatorship provides, that is complete lack of rights.
Well, as I turn it to the ranking member, my observation is when the Pope says he's no longer interested in continuing to participate in a dialogue because he doesn't think the Maduro government is serious about it. When the Pope says that, it's a pretty strong indication that of how they've used these negotiations as a farce. The ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony. I don't often read from the written testimony of witnesses, but you synthesize your testimony in order for brevity. I think there are things here worthy of reading into the record. These are your words in your statement. The reluctance of the international community to act in defense of democracy has allowed the situation to deteriorate incrementally but consistently, to the point where today it has become a full-blown humanitarian and security crisis. Every step of the way it has been too little and too late. The Democratic Charter was designed as a preventative tool. When it was agreed, it established a very explicit authority to act in every signatory state when necessity requires, which is often what I recite when I'm asked by reporters about the interventionist elements of our views. Venezuela signed on to the Democratic Charter. And the Democratic Charter calls, as you very explicitly note here, authority to act in every signatory state when necessity requires. When used as intended, It can prevent or stop any backsliding in the region's hard-earned democracies. It is true that only the people of Venezuela must solve the crisis in their country. However, in Venezuela, the words of civilians are met with the weapons of the regime. The people of Venezuela peacefully took to the streets in defense of their fundamental rights and freedoms. The regime responded strategically and systematically, targeting an unarmed civilian population with violence and terror. More than 100 people have been killed since the protests began. That is close to one person each day. Of those killed, more than 30, there's a very young audience here, were under the age of 21. 24 were students. 14 were teenagers. Since the protests began, more than 450 investigations into human rights violations have been opened. Civil society estimates that the number of civilians injured is above 15,000. As of July 22nd, there are 444 political prisoners in Venezuela, the highest number since the military dictatorship of Marcos Pérez Jiménez. These statistics do not include the thousands of lives lost in the humanitarian crisis. The regime, I continue to quote from your testimony, has consistently rejected any and all offers of international humanitarian assistance. Instead, they have weaponized what little resources they do have, selecting who gets what. President Maduro, his cabinet, and his military leaders have blood on their hands, and they must be held accountable. End quote. That is not the views of some members of the United States Senate or the statements of some members. It is the views of many of us, but it is the statements of the Secretary General of the OAS. And it is a powerful statement. It's so sad. Can you pull that up for me? It is so sad in a country that has enormous human capital and tremendous potential. So, Mr. Secretary, lo felicito por su postura vertical y su coraje y su compromiso a la democracia. I really appreciate, it's very often that in diplomacy we mitigate what is clearly the harsh and the light of day can't be mitigated, and I appreciate your straightforwardness. I want to ask you, and I don't describe this as a personal failure. It's institutionally I'm trying to understand. In June, the OAS failed to garner the 23 votes necessary in favor of a resolution on Venezuela that was introduced by Peru. I go through some, and this is not an official sheet, so I may be wrong, and I will stand corrected, but I'm going to read from what was a photograph of a sheet of who voted how. So here are the people who abstained: Antigua and Barbuda, Ecuador, El Salvador, Grenada, Haiti, República Dominicana, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and then the people who voted outright no: Bolivia, Dominica, Nicaragua, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Why do you think that you could not achieve 23 votes in what is so clear? I mean, your statement is so clear, so unambiguous, so powerful. Why do you think that countries in the face of that would abstain and or outright vote no?
Because countries vote because of their interests and not because of principles and values always. And they have strong economic, political, social links with the government of Venezuela. And those links, they definitely value a lot, enough not to vote against Venezuela in those circumstances. In any case, I have to say that the importance of that resolution was to create a group of friends in order to deal with the Venezuelan case. Those days also, the last 2 weeks before that, happened that were something like 8 or 9 initiatives of group of friends, mediators and facilitators for the Venezuelan crisis. So that solution that could have helped Venezuela, I think. In fact, I don't think the government would have accepted that way of negotiating. In any case, we have to keep working on those votes, and we have to keep making evident what is going on in Venezuela, and the situation is clear enough, but also we have to say it around. We have to be loud about, and I think it also would be extremely useful, as I said before, that this group of friends, in any case, can start working, and can start working at the level of presidents, and can make joint declarations. In fact, the most important, the biggest countries, those biggest GDP, the biggest populations, they were there in that votation, concerned about the situation in Venezuela. So it could be just, it is possible to do it and to implement it and to create that group of friends at that level of president and to make it work and to have a loud voice about what is going on in Venezuela.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce for the record all of the names of the countries that did vote in favor, and for the interest of time I have not mentioned them all because they should be applauded. But I do think it's important to name and shame those who who in essence voted to allow a continuing violation. That's the way I look at the vote. If you abstain or you vote no, in the midst of what is clearly a violation of the Democratic Charter, the OAS, for which you are a party and signatory to, then you are in essence permitting it. Do you think, last question before, I have many other questions, but I'll cease because of my colleague here is waiting. Do you believe that, I look at all of the Caribbean countries that, you know, so many of them voted either to abstain or no. Do you believe that, in fact, Petrocaribe and its influence have influence on some of the voting patterns here without specifying any specific country?
See, there is something that is makes this case very particular, and is that we are dealing with a big country that has fallen into a dictatorship. That is something that the organization usually didn't do. Usually what the organization and in general international organizations choose are small countries with small populations that have a significant coup d'etat, and then the action comes. When we have seen this process of Venezuela, we see that these kind of problems are happened in the past. I mean, I can quote, for example, the case of the mission that observed the elections where Fujimori made a fraud, and that permanent council those days didn't approve the report of the mission and supported Fujimori. The countries that were sitting there supported Fujimori in that case. So it's not the first time that happens that it is difficult to collect the votes of countries that they just don't want to vote against their national interest or their political interest. So we have to keep working, and the principles are there, the values are there, and we may be able to keep convincing people and keep convincing countries. We have convinced a lot of public opinion. We have taken the impunity away from the government, and we keep pushing. If we see the process since the 31st of May, when I presented my first report, till now. When I presented my first report, I was practically alone, talking about political prisoners in Venezuela, talking about the need to implement the recall referendum. That was the institutional solution of the country. and of course to stop stripping the powers of the National Assembly. If we see me myself alone there, and now we had 20 votes in Cancun, we have improved a lot, and I think if you ask me, and I support the decisions of the country that went through the process of consultation meeting of Minister of Foreign Affairs. But the rules of the meetings of Minister of Foreign Affairs is that decision have to be approved by 2/3 of the member states. If we would have gone through the application of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, we should have just needed a simple majority, and that, I think, was the problem. More the procedure than the number of votes.
Thank you.
And the ranking member has entered into the record without objection a portion